There seems to exist, if not a majority or a consensus, then a very repeatedly vocal minority of people who think that the notion that Korean players with any sort of average or through line are better than Western players, we're talking about the top level here, is, you know, nonsense. It's just tactic, it's just team play that get them wins, or it's having a better practice environment, or having a better culture, or that dreaded word infrastructure that's thrown around without a lot of explanation of exactly what that means and how that determines what would make them better, and establishing the premise that people present. Instead, that's accepted as the premise, and therefore people get very defensive over the notion that Western players are as good and that Korean players are overhyped. And so what tends to happen is, when a Korean player comes over and he plays in the LCS, whether it's EU LCS or NA LCS, obviously we didn't have many Koreans in EU LCS until Season 5, but now we have some. There's a tendency for people initially, especially those who have been fans of that player and seen him play in Korea or in another region like China, in the case of Spirit and Fnatic obviously, who to say, oh, this guy's incredible, and as a result, you know, he's going to smash the LCS, and think about how he's going to do, like, so in the case of Spirit, you know, he's going to destroy guys like Shook, who've been out of form for a long time, he's going to kill Lul Exos, and so then when they don't do it, or they just perform to a decent level, people want to go, ah, see, this shows it. Outside of their infrastructure and the team setup and communication, you know, they're not as good as we all thought they were, you know, they're not the gods that people made them out to be. And here's the thing, I can understand where the basis for that comes from, not just to be cynical and say, oh, these people want to protect their own ego, that Westerners are as good and that their favorite players are as good, that they support, etc. I also think part of it is a backlash against people who are fans of the Korean scene, who sometimes come off a little bit obnoxious by suggesting things like this. Oh, yeah, okay. So for example, oh yeah, Kuro might not look that great in LCS, in LCK, obviously not talking about this season, talking about season 5, but you know, if he was in LCS, you know, don't worry, he'd smash almost everyone there, and he'd be like a top 2 mid, and he'd wreck everyone's faces. Or in the past, I mean, this is an example that I put to Monte Cristo, my first grilled interview with him, a team like SK Telecom, the Reapered SK Telecom, which was, at the time, probably like the 5th or 6th best team in Korea, in the early 2013, I asked him, you know, if that team went over to NLCS, would they win an LCS? And, you know, Najin Shield, similar, 5th to 8th level team at the time, would they win an LCS? And he thought yes, and, you know, by like a comfortable margin. Now, it's worth pointing out, saying an entire team going over with all their pieces intact is very different from saying a player would. But I know that a lot of experts about the Korean scene think that a lot of the star players would do very well in an LCS and ULCS. And by the way, so do I. And so as a result, since we've had all these incidents, which have had varied success, so Emperor, I mean, when he was in Blaze, he was one of the best AD carries in Korea, probably top 3, top 4. He came over, I mean, initially he went to Brazil and did badly there, and so everyone was like, well, if he can't even do well in Brazil, how could he be that good? And then he came over to, obviously, NLCS, and he was like, okay, for a game or two, and then he came to G2 and EULCS, he was pretty good, but he wasn't a god by any means. You have OQ, was absolutely one of the most phenomenal, explosive, exciting talents at AD carry, in terms of like a hard carry AD carry in Korea when he was with Najin. And then he comes over, he wasn't even in LCS, he was in Challenger Series with TDK, and he was good, but it wasn't monstering every game, it wasn't destroying people who had no names, essentially. GBM was literally at one point in time like the 2nd best mid laner in the world. I think you could literally make that case, if not top 3, when he was on Jin. He was a phenomenal player. He came over, now in NRG he didn't do badly, but he had some games that were just so-so, along with some very good games as well, and he didn't make himself like the clear-cut best mid in an LCS, despite the fact he's playing against, you know, some players who aren't from Korea. Piglet, obviously, has now established himself as one of the best AD carries in the whole West. But when he first came over, I mean, he was coming off that down period in SKT. But even so, when he did badly in those first few games, a lot of people were like, this guy's nothing like when he was compared to me. It's overrated, washed up, like can't play in an LCS. I thought he was going to smash everyone. And obviously, the other example I gave, Spirit, who came over, former World Elite, before that Samsung Blue, OGN champion, 2-time OGN finalist, World's top 4 finish. Now, these are some great examples where you can see the varied success or lack of success depending on which player we're talking about. Now, here's the thing. To solve this problem, to help you bridge the gap as to why these players can be gods in Korea, and then they can come up to LCS and be less than gods, some of them be bad, or just be good above average in LCS, and EU LCS players, to bridge the gap, to make both possible in terms of being accurate and reasonable characterizations at the same time, without it having to be, they were gods, and then something happened and we can't explain it, or they are actually just average and at the level of LCS, but somehow infrastructure props them up and makes them good. Rather than it be one or the other, we're going to make it so that both the initial scenarios, as I said, can be correct, which is try this thought experiment. So rather than the Korean, because a lot of people, as I'm going to explain through the thought experiment, a lot of people aren't taking into consideration that you can't compare just their individual play in the two regions without all the context. So to highlight this, I'm going to go the other way. We're going to say, what if Koreans wanted to buy some of the NALCS players? And so they'd heard about some of the best NALCS players, and let's say Korea got a massive cash injection, you know, of the level of China. So they could really make an offer that was like 5 times the salary of any NALCS player. So let's imagine this, okay? Everyone in the West has hyped up Bjergsen. Now, rightfully so. In NALCS, this guy has been near godlike in terms of relative contrasted to the other people at his role in NALCS and the other players in NALCS for most of the splits that he's played in NALCS. He has clear-cut been one of the best foreigners for almost his entire time he's been in the NALCS. He's a fantastic player. He can play many different styles of play. He's very well-rounded in his champion pool. He can hard carry. He can support the team. He can even do a little bit of shot calling. Still not that great at it. And he's proven himself in the playoffs time and time again. Every single LCS final. So think of this guy. Now let's imagine that a Korean team comes in and they buy him up. So we're not going to say the best Korean team, because usually these Koreans don't go to the best team. They usually go to like 3rd or 4th best team. So let's imagine that Jin Air Green Wings, I mean Jin Air now, comes in and they say, you know what, Kuzon's great, but Bjergsen, I mean obviously the hype Bjergsen relative to his region's much better. We're going to bring in Bjergsen here. He's going to come over. And so what happens is Bjergsen flies over to Korea, he signs his contract, and he moves into the team house. Now, he's playing with 4 Koreans and against 5 Koreans. So, when he plays with the Koreans, immediately, from day 1 of practicing, and then let's say he has like 2 weeks practice, like a lot of these players do before they start LCS, he has 2 weeks of scrims and solo queuing before he plays his first LCK game. Now, in his first LCK game, he has to, within 2 weeks, be capable of playing with players who come from a totally different region. So their style might be different, the way they engage each other in the game might be different, even the rules of thumb of like where you're safe on a particular lane, or how your jungler will help you if he comes to your lane. All these things he has to just instantly pick up. Because we're not going to consider any of that context. People don't do that when the Koreans come over. So we're just going to have to, he's just going to have to pick all that up instantly, because we're just assuming that the playing with 4 Koreans is like playing with 4 North Americans. Now, he's playing against 5 Koreans, so he's also playing against the types of players that he doesn't play on a daily basis and doesn't play on a regular basis in professional matches. He's used to playing against North Americans and then Europeans, etc. Now, he must immediately, once he moves over, start Korean lessons. Now, wait a minute, why would he have to start Korean? Oh, because the whole thing is, the rest of his team's Korean, so they're not going to take English lessons so they can all speak to him. They're definitely not all going to start speaking in English on the whole team. That would be ridiculous. So as a result, as he's starting to try and figure out how to play with Koreans and against Koreans, he must also begin Korean lessons. And he's not going to be very good at Korean for a long time. He's only going to be able to learn initially like the alphabet and some numbers and some very basic commands. And luckily for him, a little bonus that doesn't necessarily translate the other way, they do use a few Korean English terms when they do shot calling anyway in Korean server. So he'll have a few things that he have initially, but very, very basic, like the most basic level of comms possible. So as a result, he's going to have to use pings to communicate in his first, let's say, month or so, because his Korean's not going to be very good after a month. We're talking maybe a year of diligent effort to get half decent at Korean. And at that point in time, that's mainly to listen, not to speak that much. So he's going to mainly have to use pings. So when his jungler comes to his lane, he has to try and know what the jungler means when he pings on the spot. Does the jungler mean I'm going to stand there? Does he mean, is that warded? Does he mean I'm going to come in now? Does he mean, like, that's where the enemy jungler will appear in a minute? He's only going to learn these things through rote of playing with that guy for weeks, months, seeing what is like different from practice in a game. Yeah, sure, he has a translator into English, and they tell him some things in the team house, and they do their best to work with him, and they take him out for English food every now and then in ETA1, and they let him have Western food and burgers and stuff just to make him feel good, and then they just put him in the server again. Okay, now play the way we want you to. He doesn't understand what they're saying. Okay, bring in the translate. Okay, I'll play. Now, not only that, he must instantly perform well. If he doesn't perform really well, you know, almost to the, like at least 80% the max of his ability, within the first sort of like 4 to 5 games, maybe they'll just bench him like they did with Piglet. And you know what? If he gets angry and frustrated, or he feels like he's not being given space to play the way he wants to play. Like, for example, by the way, it happened to Incarnation. Jensen, when he first went to Cloud9 and his jungler didn't support him the way he needed to feel comfortable. If that starts to happen and he gets angry or upset, and then the culture clash makes it so that he says something that he thinks is just normal frustration for a teammate, but they take it as very rude, you know what? Just like Piglet and Team Liquid, maybe they have his mum call him up and say, listen, you're fucking up this opportunity. And if you don't buck your ideas up, they're going to kick you out and your career's going to be over. You're making a disgrace towards yourself and your family. Oh, you know what? If you can't succeed at this, don't come home. Imagine that happened to him, okay? No, let's forget that for a second. So continue on. Not only must he perform well instantly, because we're not taking any of these factors I've said in consideration of context in judging him being fair, but he doesn't know the culture at all. He doesn't know when he's insulting an opponent. He doesn't know when it's playful banter with someone. Sure, there are simple things that are slightly universal, but some of that, by the way, as an experience of someone who's been a Western living in Korea, some of that you actually realize isn't universal. It's just that Koreans know a little bit about Westerners from tourism and stuff, and so they just either learn a little bit of your culture, so you're not really learning theirs and just like it's all universal. They're actually giving you kind of like special consideration, or even worse, when it's just normal day-to-day stuff, they let you get away with stuff because they know you're an ignorant foreigner who doesn't know their culture. Now, in a team setting, in a work setting, that very quickly is going to wear off. They're going to demand that you do things their way, the Korean way. And this is also going to add pressure to how you compete, how you play, whether the coach thinks you're listening to him, whether he thinks that you're competing hard enough, whether he thinks that you give a good enough reason as to why this went on, whether you understand the structure of the team. So a player like Bjergsen, for example, he comes in, he's the star player, right? He's the best player on the team, skill-wise, when he joins Junior. So he comes in, they should build things the way I do. Well, actually, in Korea, when you join a team, you're the rookie. You're lowest on the hierarchy. And if you're younger than anyone, God forbid, you are lowest on the hierarchy, maybe forever. Like, you can become the superstar player. And maybe, if you really prove yourself and you win your teammates over charisma-wise, you can start to build a little bit of cachet to act a little bit outlandish. But in general, no, you better understand the culture. And if you don't understand this, and if you ever talk back to the coach, you might be in real big trouble. So as a result, you can see how there are a lot of ways that a fantastic player like Bjergsen, with all his talent, could actually fail if he went to Korea, and could have a very hard time adapting and being in this situation if he was over in Korea in this scenario. We can see how, just adding this context in, before we've even seen him play the games, we can already see all the pitfalls that could possibly befall him. And yet, so rarely when we think of these Koreans in the West, do we bother to stop and think about this level of difference. It's not just coming over and playing the same game and it being played the same way, and if you underperform, you're just not a good player. I mean, you have to consider, these guys, so we'll go with the Koreans now, when they come over to the West, they basically have the most minimal level of team play outside of intuitive and natural synergy. And that's the sort of thing you can't bank on. It just is there initially, and you get people who just vibe off each other, and it just happens to work. That happens every now and then. It doesn't happen in the majority of cases. That's the whole point of what coaching and working together as a team and having really good communication and shorthand for each other is all about. It's establishing an artificial scaffold for that sort of intuitive team play and natural synergy, which one day you hope you can then take away like scaffolding, and it will be there built up, but it's not going to be there from day one for most people. And so as a result, what's the other way that you build up chemistry and get to know people? You try to get to know them as a person, right, outside of the game. So you try and build time connecting with them and build up a relationship. It's going to be very hard to do that if you don't speak their language. As a result, you're not going to be able to understand the nuances of strategy. You're going to understand the overarching amount. You're going to know by trial and error when they tell you did the wrong thing, that you didn't do it right, but you're not going to understand very simple subtleties. When people say things, they often take for granted that you have a similar dictionary, that you even understand the concept of what they mean by that. They don't say everything and add all the things that you could put in square brackets and break down every little extra detail, because when they talk to other people know these concepts, and other people know what they mean by that. And other people know, without them saying, especially in English, sometimes what the implication of that is, what that actually means you're expected to do, because of the way society and culture operate. Also, if you don't get along with these people, you're not naturally charismatic, you might be quite isolated personally. You might not be able to have these relationships. That might make you a little bit depressed. That might put more pressure on you and more strain on you to compete. So you can see how, with a very simple thought experiment, it's incredibly difficult for Koreans to come over to the West. And as a result, any who actually do play to a very high level and as well or comparable as they have in Korea, like for me at the moment, Piglet is, GBM has at times, these guys, they have all my admiration. And I would hope that people are a lot more compassionate towards Koreans when they see them in these other regions.